Hi everyone, so welcome to this webinar for Essential Piano Technique by Penelope Roskell. We're joined by the author today, and I'll hand over to her in just a minute. I'm Rachel from Faber Music and Edition Peters Marketing, and we're delighted to host this webinar today. We will have some time for questions at the end, so please do pop your questions in the Q&A section on the webinar, and we'll try and get to all of those at the end. Do say hi in the chat where you're from. It's really lovely to see people from across the globe joining us. If for whatever reason you haven't been able to join today, you may be watching this back on the recording. We will be sending out the recording to all registrants, so that's going to be available shortly after the webinar. And do stick around to the end of the webinar. We'll be telling you a bit about a discount code where you can use for the books. Also do follow Edition Peters publications on social media to keep up to date with news from Penelope and about her publications and others. But for now, I think I will hand over to Penelope and we'll get the webinar started. Penelope.
Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me today. It's lovely to see so many people here. Rachel, could you put up the first slide, please? So I'm going to be talking about my new technique books for children. The series is called Essential Piano Technique. There are 3 books currently in the series. The first one is Primer A, it's called Hop, Skip and Jump. Then Primer B, which is making waves, and then we go to level 1, which is called Leaping Ahead. And the 3 books are intended really to cover the first 2 or 3 years of learning. We're very aware of the fact that some students would go through them very quickly and some would want to take a lot more time. So we don't want to be too specific on that. At the end of level 1, they will have reached a very, very high level of grade 1, according to the ABRSM, and it's fairly compatible with the Royal Conservatory as well. So they will have learnt a huge number of techniques which will stand them in very, very good stead for years to come. If we could have the next slide, please, Rachel. So I know some of you know the books, some of you already have them, some of you have already been using them. I know some of you will perhaps just have known me from The Complete Pianist, and to some of you my work is completely new. So I'm going to firstly explain why I wrote the books and explain a bit of the rationale behind them, because they are quite different to other techniques you might have used or seen. I'm going to show you a few examples of some of the techniques and how you can approach them sequentially. Some suggestions about how to teach the books effectively. And as Rachel said, I will be taking questions at the end, so please do add those to the chat. Next one, please, Rachel. So when writing these books, my first thought, well, what do children really need? And I think that an approach to technique where you think of technique as just scales, arpeggios, and some finger technique is very, very boring. And it doesn't actually equip them for playing with a wide range of music that they will encounter later on. So we've wanted to produce a very broad and varied approach to technique. It's not just finger technique, it's about how we use the whole body at the piano. It's about how to sing on the piano, how to sing beautiful phrases, how to create wonderfully rich and varied sounds. It's got rotation, it's got leaps, it's got all the different aspects of technique they might want to learn. Children don't want to sit around for hours and hours practicing one technique with a lengthy exercise. They want to see immediate results. So we've tried to make everything very efficient in a way, keep the exercises and the note learning very quick, and so that the students always see that it's got a very clear purpose. So every exercise is followed by a musical piece, so they see it being put into practice. One of the really important things that we're trying to achieve here is for the student to adapt a really natural hand shape, because so many children, when they're young, their hands go into distorted shapes. We wanted to avoid any overload. Piano playing is very complex, as you know. There's note reading, there's the two hands, there's the foot, there's everything. So we try to do a really step-by-step approach, so there's at no point does the pupil feel overloaded with too much information. And of course, children need to learn through play, and they don't want to be told, oh, move your wrist here and do this with your elbow. An image will produce the desired movement, the desired sound in a much more effective way. So we've used a lot of imagery and hopefully a certain amount of humour too. It's very light-hearted. I think for any musician, we need to be able to sing on the piano, sing through phrases. So we're encouraging quite a lot of singing, especially in the first two books. And we're encouraging some creativity. So there are some activities to do after they've learnt the exercises and the pieces where they can develop them in their own creative way. And we wanted these books not just to be techniques books, but a real rich musical experience. So every section, every technique results in a very imaginative and exciting new piece that's written specially as an example for that particular technique. Next slide, please, Rachel. And so I was thinking, well, what do teachers really need? And I think we all need resources for teaching that are quite flexible. So we've kind of tried to make these flexible, and I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit later on. We've given quite a lot of teacher support. There are tips within each section, written for you and for the student. At the end of the book, there are some quite detailed teacher notes on how to teach the techniques and a video demonstrating each of the techniques. We've given you some further reading, some follow-up things. We've suggested some related pieces that if a student wants to develop a technique further, they could choose those pieces. And we've given reference to where in my book, The Complete Pianist, you can find out more information about any particular type of technique. We're also developing teacher support groups, some professional development courses, and to recognise teachers who teach using this method. We're creating a database of teachers and an accreditation process where you can actually be recognised as an experienced teacher in this approach. Thank you, Rachel. Can we put down the slides now and put me on a full screen? So firstly, the first question is, I can't see myself, Rachel, I can see you. Can we somehow pin me?
Hi, Penelope. Yeah, you should be on screen. Anyone can.
I'm in a tiny one. I've got you as the big one. That's weird. Anyway, never mind. I can manage with that. So firstly, I think I'll just tell you a bit about what inspired me to write these books. As you probably know, I teach pupils of all different levels and different ages. And one aspect of my work is working with pianists with injuries. And very often these pianists come to me and they say, I really regret that I wasn't taught technique systematically when I was young. And so certain bad habits have developed, which over many, many years have perhaps resulted in a sort of musical frustration. They can't play how they want to play, and some tension and even injury. So what I wanted to do was to give teachers resources where they could aim to get the technique right from the really beginning stages to avoid any problems in the future. So I've made some quite radical changes to the way we approach and think about technique, which I'm going to explain to you today. So firstly, as I said, I wanted to teach how to create a wide range of musical sounds. So to connect the idea of movement with sound, because that's what music is. It's movement that creates sound. And I wanted to create an understanding of technique and habits of technique that will last them a lifetime. So the first idea was to aim for freedom of movement around the whole keyboard and in all directions. So in primer A, hop, skip and jump, we already start to talk about up and down movements, sideways movements, forward and back movements between the white notes and the black notes, and even a little bit of rotation. Now, of course, I don't use those terms to describe the movement. We use imagery instead, but these are some of the techniques that we're introducing very early on. And for each of these techniques, what we do is we start with a very broad movement away from the piano. So these are the sort of movements that a child would be using in their everyday life. So it's very natural. It's a well-coordinated movement that uses the whole arm. It might be going up, it might be going sideways. And so we start with that so they can stand up. It makes a nice break in the lesson time. And then we come down to a very simple exercise at the piano. So it's using the same technique, but refining it a little bit. And then we move that into an actual piece at the piano. And that piece will focus almost exclusively on that technique. It's not going to bring in 6 different techniques. It's just exclusively on that one technique used in both right hand and in left hand equally. So we do not start with the middle C approach. I think most of you know what I mean by that, but if you don't, I'll just explain for a minute. So if I bring my hands most naturally to the piano, they are most comfortable when they're about shoulder width apart. And so if I instead, in that way they're nicely aligned, everything's well coordinated. If I start by bringing both thumbs onto middle C, what you notice is shoulders come in, elbows come in, and most importantly, the hand starts to twist in this way. It's what we call ulnar deviation. Now, the most natural position for the hand, which is the one that we have when we're just walking down the street, is for the third finger to be in line with the forearm, not the thumb or the second finger. So this is why one of the reasons why we're avoiding middle C position initially, because it encourages some muscular imbalance. So instead of that, we're doing some exercises which move freely around the keyboard. And we start, for instance, with just an exercise. This is pretty much the first exercise, which is just called rainbows. And so we start with just drawing a rainbow in the air. Now, the aim for that is that they learn to use a very light arm. It feels floating, and it's rhythmic, and it's flowing. It's not stopping and starting. And then I suggest that they drop the pot of gold at the ends of the rainbow. So they're starting to get the idea of drop. You like the idea of dropping arm weight, but in between the arm is just floating, and it creates a rhythmic flow. So then we start doing that as an exercise, which is just, we're using 3 fingers together, so it's what I call the mitten hand, so they can't miss, and they're just going from groups of 2 black notes. So as you can see, they get used to the idea of a light floating arm and just dropping onto the notes. And then we start to refine it a little bit further, so they start to play on Ds. So they just do a D with the 3rd finger. And then we go up. And then we just start to bob on one note. And then very quickly we turn that into a piece. So what we're using here is the 3rd finger, because the 3rd finger is in the middle of the hand. I don't like to start with the 2nd or the thumb. And I use this bobbing technique in which the arm supports the finger as it plays. And at the beginning, of course, we're not starting with middle C. We're starting to use all the notes along the keyboard. So they're not going to be able to do those by reading, so we're going to be teaching those by rote, by imitation. So every piece and every exercise is in very short little groups of notes that you can play, and they can easily remember and copy it. So one of the main aims of Primer A, in particular hop, skip and jump, is to establish a healthy hand shape. And so rather than introducing the notes one at a time, C and D and C and B and so on, what we're doing is introducing the fingers one at a time. So as I said, we're starting with 3, and we do perhaps a piece with just finger 3. One of the pieces I give is Mary Had a Little Lamb, but we don't call it Mary Had a Little Lamb, we call it Can You Catch a Kangaroo? And so all they're doing is can you catch a kangaroo? Hop. And they can do a little hop in the rests. They're just hopping from note to note. They're getting the sense of a light and flowing movement from note to note. They're doing it with the 3rd finger, and if their finger tends to collapse or the hand goes into a bad position, you can encourage them to use what I call the eagle beak, where the thumb touches the joint, the nail joint, and that just keeps everything nicely rounded. And they can continue doing that as they add in finger 2, which is usually quite strong and not a problem, and finger 4 if they can do that comfortably. So we introduce each finger one at a time, and they learn to balance the hand on that finger. So everything is feeling very balanced. They're not tipping over, they're not twisting in any way, they're just nicely balanced, they're secure on each finger. So we focus, for instance, we give a little bit of time to focus on the 5th finger, so that can keep its natural curvature. And so the hand doesn't roll over, for instance, when you play the 5th finger. We spend a little time also focusing on the thumb, so that it really plays here on its corner, so that it doesn't sort of play somewhere down here. We've all seen these slightly odd approaches to technique that children tend to do. So while introducing the 5 fingers, what we're doing is building up towards what I call the Chopin hand position. Now, I'm sure many of you know this. Chopin didn't teach C major as the first scale to his pupils. He taught B major. And the reason for that is because if I just drop my hand without thinking onto a keyboard, what will happen is my longer fingers 2, 3 and 4 will fall near or on the black notes, and the thumb and 5th finger will land on the white notes. So this is the most natural hand shape. So this is the position we're working towards initially. So once all 5 fingers have been introduced, we've actually got a piece which uses precisely that hand position, which you might think that would be a bit difficult to do, but the composer Aaron Burroughs has found a really simple piece, charming, that uses simple patterns that a pupil can learn really easily. So I'll just demonstrate it for you. So it starts with a little teacher accompaniment, so the pupil learns to wait, to listen, and to find out when to come in. So it's just got this. And then the right hand plays all the notes of that position. With my left hand, I'm playing the teacher part. And the teacher takes over again. And then the pupil comes in and plays exactly the same tune in the left hand, but it's inverted. So it's still using that bobbing technique. So as you can see, every piece is treated equally in both hands. So they learn each technique equally. And again, up till now, everything's pretty much taught by rote because they're not notes, sharps and things that they would be able to read on the stave. So when we do start to introduce the stave, I do write the pieces in C major hand position. So this will fit in very well with any tutor books you're using. And so for instance, learn it around the middle C area. But I would encourage you, as soon as they've learnt the notes, to then say, well, why don't you play it an octave higher or an octave lower, so that they're in a really well-coordinated position. And on all the pieces, it's very clearly stated what we suggest as being the starting notes. So what we have done is introduced some of the techniques in a different order to what you might be expecting. So for instance, I start with that bobbing technique, and then I only introduce legato a little bit later on. And the reason for that is because legato is a finger touch. Bobbing is a whole finger, hand, arm coordinated touch. So they can, even pianists with really weak fingers can do that quite easily. When they start to play legato, what happens sometimes is that they start to feel they've got to press, some of the others' fingers come up, the wrist tightens, so technical problems might start to slip in. So we've left the legato introduction until after they've done a few little strengthening exercises to strengthen the hands and fingers. Those little strengthening exercises, you'll find them in the book. One of them is called Nitter Natter, and it's just doing this movement. So this is strengthening the hand arch, strengthening the independence of the fingers. There's one that I call itchy knee, where they're just actually scratching their knee, and as you can imagine, that is strengthening this joint here, the nail joint. And there's one called caterpillars, again, where they're just doing little movements like this along the piano. I hope you can see. Again, it's strengthening the arch of the fingers. So we introduce legato a little bit later, and we also introduce chord playing a little bit later than you might be expecting. That's because if you introduce chords too soon, what often happens is the hand can't quite cope with it. And say, for instance, just trying to play 1, 3, and 5, what happens is the other fingers come up. Or trying to press all 3 notes down, the wrist tightens up, they start to press into the keys. So again, we've left that a little bit later until the hand is strong enough to be able to play chords really comfortably. And I'm going to give you some practical examples a bit later on how I introduce legato systematically, and also how we step by step move towards playing chords comfortably. Another thing is how we introduce dynamics. I think introducing changing dynamics is incredibly important. It's a musical experience, and all children want to play forte. They want to play it super quietly. But it's difficult again to do that with just a finger touch. If you try and do a finger touch with playing forte, then again you're likely to press and tense up. So when we've introduced the dynamic contrast, we've done it usually in a detached piece, so that then the fingers have the support of the arm. So what the student starts to recognize is that if they're playing like a grasshopper, the arm is very light. If they're playing like a kangaroo, or if they're playing it like an elephant, they're using different energy, different weight in the forearm. Of course, we don't explain it like that. Just by using the image of different animals, they automatically seem to understand the quality of the movement. I also compare, for instance, play like a ping pong ball or play it like a basketball. So they're getting the idea of these different dynamics, but it's all actually with a very well coordinated movement. There's a rather cheesy piece at the end of book 1, which is just called Forte Piano, but it's encouraging them to feel one hand doing forte and the other playing piano, for instance. So it just goes forte, piano, play piano, forte, forte. Very simple, a little bit cheesy, but children enjoy it because they're getting the sense of different sounds. Another thing we've really taken into consideration is that a lot of pupils, when they start, they have very small hands. We've avoided stretches. The maximum opening out is in level 1, and that's to the 6th for broken chords. So we've kept everything in a way that can be managed by very small hands. So, for instance, there is a piece called Jelly Beans, and it's at the interval of a fifth for 1 and 5. Now, I know that's not the normal position for some tiny children with tiny hands. So what you can just do is move the hand along so that the hand still stays in a comfortable position. They're not feeling they've got to stretch out. We've tried to avoid any sense of overload. We want to empower students to feel that they can do all these techniques. So we've done it in a very step-by-step approach. We've kept the note learning as simple and as short as we can, so that they can really focus on the relationship of the movement and how each different sort of movement creates a different sort of sound. So they've really got time to listen and enjoy the musicality of everything they're doing. So a lot of the exercises and pieces are introduced hands separately initially. In fact, all of them are, I would say. And so what the aim of that is to make sure that each technique is fully embedded into the muscle memory of each hand before you try and combine the two hands together, either in the same technique or actually trying to do two separate techniques. I mean, when they get a little bit more advanced, for instance, and they're doing something like this minuet. Sorry. Now, in the second bar there, the right hand is doing what I call a down-up hop. Down, up, hop. And the left hand is doing a swiveling action. And if neither hand has fully embedded that action and neither of them really know that technique well, then what's going to happen is there's going to be a compromise and they're both just going to play in a very sort of compromised technique. So they're going to play like this. Right? So we think, oh my goodness, this is an unmusical student. Why are they playing so unmusically? They're not unmusical, they just haven't learned the right gesture, the right physical movement to really play very musically. In that way, they can gradually work towards contrapuntal playing, which sounds very, very musical. So what we do is we introduce every technique hand separately, and then when they're ready, we can introduce them perhaps as in contrary motion, and then gradually do more work in parallel motion, which is a little bit more complicated, as you know. And the final thing that was really, really important for me is that I wanted to really engage students. I wanted them to feel curious. I wanted them to be intrigued and interested. I want to ask them questions. So we've got a little character who's called Curious Cat, and his purpose is to ask questions or give them little tips about how to practice. And as I said, we're using imagery to try and fire up their imagination and keep it simple, but to evoke a very, very fundamental and very important musical, a movement that creates a musical gesture. And in a way, most importantly, we try to keep it very light-hearted and fun. The words are entertaining, they're great. There are some games, there are activities, the music is very rewarding. And the warm-ups, you can stand up for them, you can move around, you can keep the lesson very varied. So I'm now going to demonstrate two of the techniques for you. So I'm going to start with legato, and how we build up towards a really good playing of legato. Now, firstly, so we start, as I just said, we're using cantabile to learn how to drop onto notes. Sorry, the rainbows, learning how to drop onto notes in a cantabile way. And then we lead into a technique that I call the parachute touch. Many of you who've heard me speak or read my books in the past will be very familiar with that. So I won't go into it in detail, but all it involves is just dropping into a note using gravity. And we start with just playing with one finger, and we're just playing. And just by using the drop, using the gravity, we're creating a cantabile sound. It's still detached. And so the piece I use for that is Pachelbel's canon. So if the teacher adds in the accompaniment, it sounds like this. and then they start to do it with different fingers, and then eventually they also do it. They start to do it in thirds. So they get very confident with just dropping into the notes in a very cantabile way. But then, of course, we want to use that to start off a longer legato phrase. So what I do for that is an exercise I call drop and walk away from home. And actually we do it first on our leg, and we just drop into the first note on second finger, and then we just walk 2, 3, 2, 3. We're walking away from home. And so we're getting the sense of transferring the weight from one finger to the next. Again, we don't use that expression. We talk about walking legato, walking fingers, because if they experience just walking around the room, they'll notice it feels very similar. So then we translate that onto the piano, and we're just doing, and then we do it with all the different fingers, maybe with a bigger interval, and then a bigger interval. And you can see what starts to develop there is a little bit of rotation too. So this is how we introduce rotation a little bit in hop, skip and jump. So this then leads to longer legato phrases. And so one of my favourite pieces here is called I'm a Flabby Tabby Cat. And they sing the tune first. It's actually a traditional tune. And it's got a teacher accompaniment as well. But they start by dropping into the first note, and then they transfer the weight into the other fingers. Now what they do is they lift their hand, which they've learnt to do, and then they just drop back, parachute back. So we call that the breathing wrist. So it's so what they've learnt to do there is to sing through a phrase, play beautifully cantabile, and breathe between the phrases. So it's an example of how we're, yes, teaching technique, but we're also teaching musicianship at the same time. So I also want to just give you a demonstration of how we introduce chords. So again, we start by just doing cantabile chords. And so we drop with the parachute onto an open fifth. And the reason why we start with an open fifth is because the thumb and the fifth finger are more independent of the rest of the hand. So it's much easier for them to play 1 and 5, an open fifth, than it is for them to immediately go into playing 1, 3 and 5. So we start by just dropping onto a fifth. Then we want to add in the third finger. So we do that by an exercise that I call nodding bird. And what we do here is we drop into the fifth, and then what we're doing with the next note is we're doing an upward movement. So it's like a bird pecking for food. So the movement is that. And the fact they're doing the forward movements means it's very difficult for them to do that and to tighten up and to collapse the hand out. So it's encouraging their hand into a good position for a triad. So they do that a few times, and then they drop onto the full triad. So they can do it there. And by that point, they should have a really beautiful natural hand shape. So once they've become very confident with that, then we start to add in staccato chords. And again, we start with a fifth and then work towards the full triad. And if you think about a staccato chord, it's actually using gravity to drop, and then it's using the natural rebound to come back up again. So we start by, so they've already learned how to drop, so now they're just learning how to bounce back out again. And the image I use for this, I call these jellyfish jumps. So what a student is doing is first, we just practice moving the hand around the air like a jellyfish. And what's that is teaching them is to keep the hand really soft when it comes up. So because the image of jelly encourages them to have a really soft hand. So when they start to play, they've got to, so we've got So you see, as they bounce up, they develop the habit of keeping the hand very soft in between the chords. And then quite soon, they're ready to add in the middle note. So they just add in the third. Now, we have a lovely piece here, which uses those staccato triads. And it's called Flamenco Nights. Now, the pupil part is incredibly easy, so they can really focus on the good technique. So they're playing, their left hand starts with just an F chord and an E chord, and the right hand does the same. So it seems, it's very easy, rather boring perhaps even. But once they get to the next lesson and they play it with you and the accompaniment joins in, it starts to sound like this. So you see how what we're trying to do is to keep the student part very simple so they can really focus on good technique, but give them a really rich and vibrant musical experience. So I'm now just going to talk a little bit about how you can employ these books within the piano lesson, because that's what many teachers have been asking me. They are technique books. I would say they're also repertoire books, they're also musicianship books, but what they are not is theory books. So you will certainly have to supplement them with some practice in note reading, practice in explaining what the rests are, what the note lengths are, and so on. So you will want to supplement it in some way. Some teachers are already using this as their main book and supplementing it with other methods or other books that they like to use, especially for the theory and the note learning. But many teachers are using it with the method book that they're already using, and adding it in and sort of dovetailing it around. In fact, I was doing a webinar last week, and the person in charge of the webinar has written books for children. She was jumping up and down in excitement and says, I want to talk about how we can dovetail these in and use these together. So I think it can be used with quite a lot of method books, particularly the more enlightened, more modern method books. So it's worth, I think, spending a bit of time thinking about how you would combine that over the summer before you start teaching, if you're going to be having some new students in the new term. It's worth looking at the books, thinking about how you might use them, perhaps looking at the teaching notes at the back, watching the videos, because you really can't teach a technique unless you know how to do it yourself. So it's worth spending a little bit of time working them out for yourself as well. One question that keeps coming up is, can you use them also with exams? And yes, certainly you can. I didn't follow the exam syllabus, but I did look closely at the exams. So for instance, Primer A and Primer B do work towards all the requirements that you would need to have under your belt for the initial exam. And level 1 certainly takes you to an extremely high level of grade 1 ability. But I really encourage everybody to use these books quite flexibly. I'm not rigid. I don't want you to follow exactly what I'm doing. Your pupils will have different ages, different personalities. Some may prefer to learn more by rote. Some are very quick at note reading. Everything is quite pattern-based, so you can use either. Some will want to move through very quickly. Some will really want to take a lot of time on each lesson. For those who want to enhance what they're doing, to embed it a bit further, there are extension activities for each of the techniques. Some of them are just sort of reinforcing the technique. Some of them might be encouraging that they improvise on the technique, or that they understand the theory a little bit more and perhaps modulate using that same exercise, for instance. So we're wanting you to use your creativity and imagination, if you like. and also to encourage that in the pupil. So for instance, I asked Aaron, the composer, for some of the pieces, can we please leave out dynamic markings here, so that then we can say to the student, how do you want this piece to sound? What dynamic markings do you want to write in? So we're encouraging their own ownership of the pieces, so they can choose how they feel about the piece and how they want to interpret it. So we're encouraging a lot of active listening. We're encouraging you, when necessary, to change the order. Now, I have really carefully structured them in a very carefully progressive way, as I think I was trying to explain when I was showing you how we introduced legato and chords. But of course, if you're using a method book, you might come across a piece that involves chords a little bit earlier than I brought it in. So you might want to change the order a little bit as you go through, and that's fine. You might, for instance, have a transfer student who's a little bit more advanced. But you feel they've missed out on certain techniques. So you might want to just dip in, choose some of the techniques that you think they really need, and then move quickly on to the level that they're already at. So there's quite a lot of flexibility there. We'd aimed it for the younger age range, and so the pictures and the language are very child-friendly. But the music is very rich and mature, and the exercises are relevant to pianists of all ages and actually all levels. So a lot of the material can be used for other ages. They can even be used for adults, and I have found that adults love images like spiders and jellyfish and so on. You just have to adapt some of the language a little bit. So think of these as tools that you have in your toolbox. You learn all the techniques, each one you put in the toolbox, and when they need it, and when they've learning a piece for an exam and it's got 3 different techniques, they've already got them. They're there already. So it should be really easy for them to learn their new pieces. Rachel, could you just put up the slides again? Because I just want to show a few sample pages to show you how they look on the page and how you might use them. So the first one, okay, so we don't say, now keep your hand arched, think about your hand shape. We just say, this is the sleepy spider. So that's your natural hand shape, sleepy spider here. Tip your hand over, your wide awake spider. Please don't play like a squash spider, which is that, of course. And then we also have a bouncy spider as well, springy spider. Next one, Rachel. So that's showing how we use imagery rather than complicated language. This is, I think, the second piece in the book. It's called Cowboy Song. It's only using 2 fingers and 2 notes. The exercises have led towards it, so they'll find the note reading very easy. As you can see at the top of the page, there's a little keyboard, so they know which notes to play on when they're practicing. There's a picture of a cowboy in the moonlight, which sort of evokes the mood of the piece. The music in this beginning stages is written off the stave, so all the notes are going up and down, so they're just following the up and down movement of the notes. There's an accompaniment for the teacher at the bottom of the page. There's Curious Cat giving them some little tips about how to play the piece. And then there's a little place at the end, at the end of each chapter, to put a sticker or something if you want. Next one, Rachel. So this is just an example. Parachuting cat is a really important technique. And so what I'm trying to encourage them to do is to imagine that the hand is like a cat coming down in a harness from a parachute, and they're coming down and they're landing on their feet. So the hand isn't going like this. So I've written quite a lot of wording which the teacher will read. You will read it, it'll help you. You might read it to them, but actually what they need to do is to look at the pictures, because they see the cat coming down, landing on its feet, and they don't want the cat to splat flat. Next one, Rachel. So the next one is just, again, going back to the jellyfish jumps that I was talking about earlier. So you see how the picture, again, evokes that very fluid character of a jellyfish, which helps them to imagine that the hand is very soft, like jelly. Final slide, please, Rachel. Rachel did mention that Faber is very kindly offering a 20% discount to everybody who's been on this webinar. That's the code PR20, and you can go on Faber Music / Edition Peters if you're in UK or in other countries. I know in America they tend to use alfred.com, but for either of them you can put in that code for a 20% discount. What we're trying to develop here is a lot of support for teachers. So if you'd like to go on the website, which is roskellacademy.com, if you sign up to the website, you'll receive occasional newsletters. They're not every week, they're only every few months, which gives information that'll tell you when we create some new books. There are some training courses that we're preparing at the moment, how to work towards accreditation if you're interested in that. There's also a Facebook group, which we could just call the Roskell Academy Piano Group. That's for teachers who are using the method, and then they can discuss what's working for them, any problems that they have. They can talk to somebody who's perhaps been using the books for a little bit longer with a wider range of students. And there's just details there also about my other book, which is The Complete Pianist. If you're not familiar with that, that's aimed at much more advanced pianist from grade 5, 6 upward towards professional. So it's more like a real encyclopedia of piano playing. So what we've been doing with the Essential Piano Technique books is to try and fill up that gap, so we're creating resources for beginner pianists. Well, I hope that's all been useful. Are there any questions? Rachel, have you been sort of checking out any questions? Are there any things that people really want to ask?
We had a couple of questions. I think a few people had some queries about the level and the age. I know you touched on it being aimed towards the younger pupils, but for older students who are more advanced and have had little technique, do you think that this is a good series for them, or is it best for beginner students?
Right. Well, these techniques are about movements, and they're movements that we use when we're beginners. We use the same movements when we become intermediate and when we're advanced. I am teaching jellyfish jumps. I am teaching parachute touch. I'm even teaching walking legato to new college students who are arriving in college. If they don't have good chord playing, if they don't have a good cantabile sound, if their legato is not good. So all of these techniques, if we've got good techniques from the beginning, then those actually last us through the rest of our piano playing career. Of course, we make it more refined. We extend each technique. But the techniques the fundamental techniques are actually the same. And so what I've been trying to do in these books is give everybody a really strong foundation from the beginning. And these are all techniques which they will continue to use. So when I'm aiming at creating a few more books, and we'll be actually using the parachute touch, but in a more advanced example, for instance. We'll be doing faster playing, but they're all using these fundamental techniques. So these techniques are not babyish. They're not solely beginner techniques. They are fundamental techniques that any pianist at any level can actually use. So you just have to ignore some of the slightly more child-friendly language, but all the techniques are there for everybody to use.
Brilliant, thank you. Rachel's asking, sorry, not me, another Rachel, is asking if you have any tips for encouraging relaxed shoulders.
Oh, right. Yes. I mean, I have in the Complete Pianist, I have a whole warm-up sequence, which is about a shoulder releasing exercise. So if you can get hold of somehow, borrow one from the library, a copy of the Complete Pianist, do look at the warm-up section there. That gives a nice little sequence, which is very effective for releasing shoulders. For children, I just start by doing some warm-up exercises, and each book starts with some warm-up exercises. We start with a sitting exercise, which I just call picking cherries. So they imagine they're picking some cherries like this, and then they put them down on the keyboard. And so what that is doing is encouraging them to sit really tall rather than to approach the piano like this.
I should give that a go.
And we do, and actually we encourage them to do windmills in at the beginning of hop, skip, and jump. So again, that is just loosening up their shoulders. So gradually throughout the books, I add in a few more warm-ups to remind the teacher and to the student to keep doing warm-ups. But the idea is that once they've actually worked with these books, they won't have tight shoulders. They won't need to do them. They won't have tight wrists because they've learnt to play with it with a very relaxed wrist, because that's what parachute touch teaches them. It teaches to come down with a very soft wrist. But the fact that we've done the strengthening exercises in the hands means that they can keep a nice hand shape and yet keep that hand and arm very relaxed. So every technique, yes, I've given it here for children and written it for children, but they're all techniques that I would use with absolutely any age and any level.
Amazing. Wissam is saying absolutely wonderful, refreshing, tactile and empathetic approach, and has asked, how do you incorporate improvisation into your teaching and learning methods? I suppose that's, is there a place for improvisation when you're working on technique?
Right. Okay. Now, I am of a generation where I was not taught any improvisation. I really regret it. I'm not confident in improvisation, but I really see the benefit of it for young musicians, and I really encourage it. So, for each, very often in the extension suggestions, I'll say, well, when they've learned a piece which is just using 3 fingers, I'll say, now make up your own piece using those 3 fingers on the 3 black notes, for instance. So I'll give some little suggestions for improvisation. But I know that a lot of teachers actually have much more experience of this than I do. So, if you've got some good ideas for how to develop the technique into an improvisation, then that's a very good way to embed the technique further. Because techniques need to be practiced until you don't have to think about them anymore. And so if they're improvising but still managing to keep the technique going, then that means that it's really well established.
And Sarah is just asking a quick question on whether there is an ebook version of the books. I believe that we'll be planning some ebook versions in due course, so keep your eyes out. And translations of the books, they're only in English at the moment, but certainly, watch the space, we'll see. Gemma is saying, when I watch you demonstrate the bobbing technique, there seems to be some wrist flexibility too. How do you prevent the arms stiffening when learning this technique?
Okay. Now, I think I know who Gemma is. She's studied with me. She's used the books quite a bit already. So, Gemma, you can just encourage them to do this movement a little bit beforehand. I mean, I wouldn't worry too much if the bobbing technique isn't absolutely perfect at the beginning. This is the first few pages of the book. We're not expecting everything to be perfect at the beginning. So, for instance, when they're doing the bobbing, and then actually it's more about having the freedom of movement of the arm. And if the wrist is a little bit rigid, it's not going to matter, because very soon after that, we're going to be doing some wrist relaxing exercises. So I think, we all have to accept that not everything is going to be 100% perfect straight away. If a technique doesn't seem to work at all for a student, maybe it's not the right time for them. Maybe go on to the next technique, onto the next chapter, and then in a few weeks' time, come back and say, let's have a go at that again and see if it works better now. So that's where I feel flexibility is important, because, some people have very tight wrists, some people have very weak hands, some people have tiny hands, some are quite big. They're all different. So we have to have a certain flexibility to really encouraged to bring out the best of each student as we're teaching them.
Brilliant. I would just do a last couple of questions. Thank you so much for typing in your questions. So Trudy's just querying about the pieces. Can you saying, are they mostly rote pieces, or do they require note reading ability? I suppose that there is notation in the book, but do you feel like there's an opportunity here for these to be learned by rote, and would you recommend that?
Yeah. So actually, what we've done is about half of the first book, of Hop, Skip and Jump, is really intended to be taught by rote because we're not really using the middle C position. But then we're starting to use written notation. We're trying to keep it very simple, all within, you know, an octave at either side of middle C, really, so that they can learn the notes quite easily. They will need some help from you, from some of that, obviously, but we try to keep it as simple as possible, bearing in mind also that they're probably going to be playing an octave higher, you know, or when they're playing with the teacher, playing the duet accompaniment, they might move up the seat so that the left hand is really comfortable in the higher position, and that's all explained quite clearly in the book. I've forgotten what the original question was, Rachel.
So can we learn by rote? So I think the answer was yes, absolutely, but yeah, with sort of progressing onto notation.
So even the ones that, sorry, let me just finish with that. Even the ones that are written out and can be read by notation, if you have a pupil who, for whatever reason, it doesn't suit them to be learning from the notation, they can all be taught by rote. And for instance, I teach a lot of jazz pianists, you know, perhaps jazz pianists who need help with technique or have had hand injuries or whatever. And so they're starting to use the books with their students. Now, of course, they're not, you know, what they're doing is not reading note learning in the way, but they're using some of the exercises. They're all pattern based, so they can quickly teach them by rote. So they're teaching the techniques, even though these are basically classically based pieces. They're teaching techniques which can be transferred to all different genres of playing.
Brilliant. Thank you. And then I'll just do our final question, which is from Hazel, and I personally am invested in knowing the answer to this one as well. Can we unlearn our own bad technique fairly?
Yes, well, I think what I was saying right at the very beginning, part of my motivation for writing these books is that I have worked with students for, you know, 40 and more years, who I've been teaching them to unlearn things that they've already learned badly or bad habits they've got into. And we all know that that's frustrating, and it takes a lot of time. And it's tedious and it's boring. So that's why I'm trying to get these techniques learned really thoroughly at the beginning, so they don't go into the bad habits, so they don't have to spend all that time unlearning things. So the 3 books will take a little bit longer in many ways, because you're covering so much more technically than you normally would at this level. But they're all techniques that are just going to mean that they're never going to have to unlearn anything later on. It's all there. So they're going to move really, really quickly through the upper levels. But there was one other aspect of your question. Yes. So if you've already got some bad habits, that's what I was really trying to address in The Complete Pianist. It was aiming for people who are more advanced, who have some problems, who maybe have tension in the wrist, who maybe don't play with a beautiful sound, who struggle with leaps. So that book is very much aimed at you. But again, I've tried to start with very simple exercises, which anybody can use, which then build up step by step into showing some quite complex examples of real concert pieces. So these techniques are for everyone. So what I've been just trying to do is to modify them so that in these particular books, they really are focused more on the younger children. But the techniques are basically the same for anyone.
Amazing. Thank you, Penelope. And thank you everyone for joining us. I think that brings our webinar to a close. I just want to remind everyone, I popped the links to the books in the chat as well, and do use the code PR20 for a 20% discount through Alfred and Favour Music. That's valid until the end of 2023. And we will be sending out the link to the recording that you can watch back later at some point in the next couple of days or so. So thank you in the meantime. Thank you, Penelope, so much. That was really wonderful, very interesting. Yeah, I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.